Hi. Okay, today we're going to be looking at Concept 2, discuss the policy of containment in the four phases of its development. So the first phase of containment developed during the Truman administration between 1947 and 1953, and it had three parts. So first you had the Truman Doctrine. The initial step of the containment policy came in February of 1947, when the British informed the United States that they could no longer afford to aid the Greek government in a bitter civil war against communist guerrillas. Believing the Russians were responsible for the strife in Greece. In fact, they were not. This later became found out. Secretary of State George Marshall decided that the United States would have to take over Britain's role in the Eastern Mediterranean. Worried about congressional support, Marshall called a meeting with the legislative leadership to outline the problem. Dean Atkinson, an aide to Marshall, compared the situation in Greece to one rotten apple spoiling the entire barrel. Atkinson warned that, quote, the corruption of Greece would infect Iran and all of the East, and all to the East, Africa, Italy, and France. Atkinson concluded that, quote, we alone were in a position to break up the play, unquote. So he's outlining what would be later known as the domino theory. The bipartisan group of congressional leaders were deeply impressed. They agreed to support Marshall and the president in this area, but added that to ensure public backing, Truman would have to scare the hell out of the American people. And he did. And so begins the American policy on containment. And so in March 1947, Truman asked Congress for $400 million for military and economic aid. At the same time, he stated, it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure, unquote. So that becomes the basis of containment, trying to contain communism where it exists within the Soviet Union, stopping its spread. The Truman Doctrine marked an informal declaration of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Truman used the crisis in Greece to secure congressional approval and build a national consensus for the policy of containment. In less than 2 years, the civil war in Greece ended, but the Americans committed to oppose communist expansion, whether by internal subversion or external aggression, placed the United States on a collision course with the Soviet Union around the world. Korea and Vietnam would be the two most prominent examples. And using the atomic bomb, historians initially agreed that ending World War II dominated the president's thinking in the summer of 1945. However, in recent years, revisionists have argued that Truman's desire to practice what historian Gar Applewitz aptly calls atomic diplomacy strongly affected his decision to authorize the nuclear attack on Japan. According to this thesis, Truman sought to influence Soviet policy by dramatically proving that the United States possessed an unprecedentedly destructive weapon, the atomic bomb, that American leaders were willing to use against its enemy. With one awesome stroke, Truman could show his mettle as a tough warrior and end the war, and depreciate the Soviets' claim to share co-occupation with Japan, and discourage Soviet communist expansion into Europe and Asia. The second part of Truman's policies was seen in economic aid and the Marshall Plan. By 1947, many Americans felt Western Europe was open to Soviet penetration because of economic problems they were having in World War II. Despite the $9 billion in piecemeal American loans England, France, Italy, and other European nations had great difficulty in recovering from the war. Food was scarce. Industrial machinery was broken down, and obsolete workers were demoralized by years of depression and war. Resentment and discontent led to growing communist voting strength, especially in Italy and France. Unless the United States could do something to reverse the process, it seemed as though all Europe might drift into the communist orbit. Right. So, to many in Europe at this time, capitalism had completely failed, and so communism was definitely being considered by many as a means of organizing both political and social society. Undersecretary of Dean Acheson believed that it was time to extend American economic power to create a basis of political stability and economic well-being. A plan for massive infusion of American capital to finance the economic recovery of Europe was drawn up in June of 1947. Marshall presented the plan to Congress, which offered extensive economic aid to all European nations, in which, if they could reach agreement on ways to achieve the revival of a working economy in the world, so as to permit the emergence of a political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist, unquote. Neither Russia nor its satellites would take part, apparently because Moscow saw the Marshall Plan as an American attempt to weaken Soviet control over Eastern Europe, and rightly so. The Marshall Plan called for spending of $12.5 billion over the next 4 years in 16 cooperating countries. The plan would help the United States by stimulating trade with Europe as well as checking Soviet expansion. It was the latter argument, however, that proved decisive, which the Czech group touched off a war scare in March of 1948. Congress quickly approved the Marshall Plan by a heavy majority. Over the next 4 years, the huge American investment paid rich dividends, generating a broad industrial revival of Western Europe that became self-sustaining by the 1950s. The threat of communist domination faded, and a prosperous Europe proved to be a bonanza for American farmers, businessmen, and manufacturers. NATO, or the Western Military Alliance that developed, the third and final phase of containment under Truman came in 1949 with the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO grew out of Europeans' fears of Russian military aggression. There were two main features of NATO. First, the United States committed itself to the defense of Europe, and the key clause which stated that, quote, an armed attack against one or more will be considered an attack against them all, unquote. In effect, the United States was extending its atomic shield over Europe. The second feature was designed to reassure Europeans that the United States would honor this commitment. In 1950, President Truman appointed General Dwight D. Eisenhower to the post of NATO as Supreme Commander, and authorized the stationing of 4 American divisions in Europe to serve as the nucleus of the NATO army. Now, any Russian assault would automatically involve American troops and thus deter the Soviet Union. The Western Alliance escalated the development of the Cold War, whether its advantage in building a sense of security among worried Europeans, it represented an overreaction to the Soviet danger. Americans and Europeans alike were attempting to apply the lessons of Hitler to the Cold War. But Stalin was no Hitler, and the Soviets were not the Nazis. There was no evidence of any Russian plan to invade. Western Europe, and in the face of the American atomic bomb, none was likely. All NATO did was intensify Russian fears of the West, and thus increase the level of international tensions. The rivalry that began in Europe would soon spread to worldwide wild contests between the superpowers. By the 1950s, the Cold War had taken on global proportions. The showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union and Asia came in Korea. Traditionally, the cockpit of international rivalry in the Northeast Asia, Korea had been divided by the 38th parallel in 1945. The two superpowers pulled out most of their occupying forces by 1949. The Russians, however, helped train a well-equipped army in the north, while the United States, fearful that the Soviets would seek unification throughout the armed conquest, gave much more limited military assistance to South Korea. On June 25th, 1950, the North Korean army suddenly crossed the 38th parallel in great strength. Truman saw the invasion as a clear-cut case of Soviet aggression, reminiscent of the 1930s. Communism was acting in Korea just as Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese had acted 10, 15, and 20 years ago, unquote, according to Truman. So they're learning off the lessons, again, of the interwar period between World War I and World War II. Right? They didn't do anything, and things got out of control. So now they're planning on doing something about it. Within a few days, American troops from Japan were in combat in South Korea. The conflict would last for more than 3 years. Was technically a police action fought under the UN authority. In reality, the United States was at war with a Soviet satellite in Asia. And after a year of rapid movement up and down the Korean Peninsula, the fighting stalled just north of the 38th parallel. The resulting truce line has divided North and South Korea ever since July of 1953, the July 1953 armistice, the ceasefire. Right, the war technically is still on. Both sides are still armed to the teeth, and North Korea is as unstable as ever. That's the first phase. We'll leave it at that, and I'll talk to you guys later.